Hello and welcome to Estuary Live. My name is L.G. Adams and I'm manager of the Weeks Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. With me today is Margaret Sedlakey. She's our education coordinator here at the reserve, and Angela Underwood is our education assistant. And we're glad you could join us here at beautiful Weeks Bay in Alabama. Weeks Bay Reserve is part of a national system of reserves. It's got kind of a long name, the National Estuarine Research Reserve Systems. And those sites are located throughout the nation's coast. There's actually 27 of them. And Weeks Bay Reserve here in coastal Alabama is located on the North American continent in the southeast region. And if you look at the map, you can see that on the coast of Alabama, it's located on the Gulf of Mexico on the northern coast. And if you look at coastal Alabama, you'll see it's a very large bay located there. That's Mobile Bay. Mobile Bay is quite large and receives water draining throughout the state of Alabama. Many rivers bring their water down to the Gulf of Mexico into Mobile Bay. And if you look on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, you'll see Weeks Bay. Weeks Bay is located there, being fed by fresh water from two rivers, Fish River and Magnolia River. And it creates a very interesting and beautiful area here that we're going to learn more about today. At this point in time, I want to turn it over to Margaret.
Today we're going to be talking about three habitats found in coastal Alabama. They're the salt marsh habitat, the longleaf pine habitat, and the river delta habitat.
And we'll also talk about differences in classifications such as threatened and endangered species and why certain animals fall into these classifications.
Okay, but first we want to talk a little bit about what an estuary is. An estuary, like we have here at Weeks Bay Reserve, is a very special area. It's really any place where rivers meet the sea, and that fresh water flows from the land and meets the water, the salt water from the oceans of the world, or in our case, the Gulf of Mexico, and it creates a very special and productive area. One thing we'd like to talk about today is ways that you can try to conserve and protect these areas. One thing is just kind of common sense. Keep up with your garbage. You don't want to drop your garbage and keep that out of the water. A lot of things like plastic six-pack rings or styrofoam or paper may get in the waters and create problems for the animals that live there. Another thing that you might want to do, a lot of us like to fish, and sometimes you have tangles or old line. Please don't throw that anywhere where it can get in the water. You want to dispose of that properly, because that line can get tangled up and create problems for different organisms. Another thing, helium balloons. A lot of us like to enjoy helium balloons for celebrations and such. You don't ever want to release those helium balloons because they may wind up back in the ocean and cause problems when animals think that that's something to eat. One thing that we're going to be doing today is receiving questions, and we're excited you can join us. Please be sure and get your questions ready and email those to us, because we're excited we'll be able to answer many of those today. And I'm going to turn it over now to Margaret.
Hi, we're here today at Weeks Bay Reserve and we're celebrating National Endangered Species Day. And with me I have Dan Everson. He's a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Dan, we're happy to have you today.
Well, good morning and welcome to Endangered Species Day for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Alabama is blessed with very high biodiversity, and this is a great place for biologists like me to live and work. And one of the things that's very interesting, as I mentioned, is the very high biodiversity here in Alabama. For one example, we have over 110 species here on the endangered species list for Alabama. And these include 46 species of mussels. We've got 19 species of plants on the endangered species list. We've got over 10 species of snails. And so we have a big job here in Alabama. Over 80% of these species actually are aquatic or wetland species. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service has a big job here in Alabama.
Dan, I have a question for you here. Explain what you just said. Threatened and endangered. What's the difference between an animal that's listed as threatened and one that's listed as endangered?
The way our agency uses the terms an endangered species is one that's just about to become extinct. In other words, it's just about to disappear from the face of the earth. And we have a law that's called the Endangered Species Act that's designed to protect these species, and it's also designed to protect its habitats. We also have a category called threatened species, and those are the species that are not in quite as much trouble, but they're still protected under the Endangered Species Act. And we have, as I mentioned, we do have a big job here in Alabama trying to protect both the threatened and endangered species here.
You know, today we're going to be talking about some animals that we have here in the area that we were able to actually have here on camera, but I know that there are a lot of other endangered species here in coastal Alabama that some people may just not be aware that they're here, and of course we couldn't have them on the show today, so tell us what some of those are.
Some of the ones you may be familiar with include the sea turtles. You may also think about the manatee. One of the animals that we recently took off from the endangered species list is the bald eagle, and that was a success story down here. But as I mentioned, a lot of our species here in Alabama are aquatic. They're bivalves called mussels, and we also have a lot of snails and quite a few species here.
I also know that there's a little animal that lives down at Gulf Shores, and it's the beach mouse. Can you tell us just a tad bit about the beach mouse?
Alabama beach mouse lives on the seafront area down here on the Fort Morgan Peninsula. They live in the primary dunes, and they're a nocturnal mouse that thrives in these dunes just off of the beach here on the Gulf Coast of Alabama. And they're one of the species that we're trying to protect here in the state.
So we have a lot of teachers and classes watching us today out there. Where can teachers go to get more information, or anybody for that matter, about the endangered species that are actually in their area?
Well, if you live in Alabama, you can call our office. Our office is in Daphne, Alabama. And the other thing you can do is we do have a website, and you can check out www.fws.gov. And you can look at the endangered species link, and you can find all kinds of information about endangered species there.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about some of the causes of things that end up getting animals listed as threatened or endangered. So tell us, what do you think the biggest problem is that animals face?
The biggest issue we face here in Alabama and also nationally is just loss of habitat. And it's something that we work with day in and day out. Animals have been pushed further and further away from their preferred habitats, and that's a big concern of ours. As I mentioned, here in Alabama, about 80% of the species we work with are aquatic species, and so what we work very hard to do is try to protect the aquatic habitats in the state. For example, a lot of the rivers here in Alabama, they once were free-flowing from all the way from the headwaters in upper Alabama all the way down here to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, over the last 100 years, we've put in a series of dams on many of these rivers, and we've turned what once were free-flowing rivers into a series of deep water lakes. And that's great for if you're a bass fisherman and a power boater, but it's not so good for the mussels and snails and some of the smaller fish that once lived in these rivers. The other thing that we have a tendency to do is we remove a lot of the streamside vegetation next to our creeks and rivers. And here in the southeast in particular, what that does is tends to cause a lot of erosion very quickly, and it completely changes the habitat of our freshwater and riverine systems. And so, again, loss of habitat would be the biggest reasons why we're concerned about these aquatic species.
So I hear that what you're saying is there's some man-made causes of habitat loss, and then there's some sort of natural, if you will, habitat loss. Like, what do you think about global climate change?
Global climate change is an issue that we're starting to work on, and it basically is we're seeing sea levels rise, and we're seeing temperatures change, and storm patterns change, and rainfall patterns change, and it's something that we're going to be working with in the coming years to try to ensure that we've got habitat protected for all those species that are still going to be in this area.
Okay. I see LG's over here waiting with some questions, so we're going to take some questions.
Yeah, we have some questions coming in already this early. I hope we'll be able to answer some of these questions. Here's a question from Brookville Middle School. Miss Jones' class is asking, where do juvenile animals hide in an estuary?
You want to take that, or LG, you want to answer that?
Well, there's really a lot of places for juvenile organisms to hide. Probably the best place is in the emergent marsh when the high tide comes up. There's a lot of hiding places in and amongst the grass. Sometimes there's submerged aquatic vegetations like Vallisneria or tape grass here. Organisms can hide in there. Or various debris, logs and wood and things that come drifting down. There's a lot of places to hide, really.
Okay. Got another question for Dan?
Yes. What is an invasive plant?
An invasive plant is a plant that can outcompete all the other plants in an area. And so typically what you'll see is something like kogon grass down here in southern Alabama. You'll find it growing along the roadsides, and pretty soon it's spreading into the woods, and then it's into people's yards, and it's invading all these other areas where other plants that we would prefer to have there, it's now taken over.
So what you're saying is these plants that can outcompete native plants that are food sources for animals are a problem because the animals won't have enough food in their area, right?
Yes, that would be one of the big issues.
You have another question?
We do. This is from Bell Elementary School. Thanks for sending this in. It's Miss Elliott's 5th grade class. How many endangered species do you have in Alabama?
I can handle that one. On the threatened and endangered species list, as I mentioned before, we have over 110 species on the endangered species list. Okay.
Another one from Miss Elliott's 5th grade class are, what are manatees?
Manatees are a beautiful animal. You have to imagine a 1,200-pound mammal that lives down here in these seagrasses. And we have them here in Alabama, which many people are surprised to find out about. You often think of manatee being in Florida, but we do have them here in Alabama. They travel up the Gulf Coast. And the other amazing thing is they're actually a freshwater species. They don't spend that much time out in the saltwater. They sort of dive in and out of these coves and bays as they work their way up here into Alabama. And they'll spend the entire summer and a good bit of the fall up in our small estuary and freshwater rivers and streams here in Mobile Bay.
Can you give us some idea about what people can do to help with the manatees?
Well, one of the things here in Alabama in particular, people just aren't aware that they're here, and so they're not thinking about manatee when they're driving fast in their boats up and down some of these freshwater streams. And so boating is one of the biggest causes of manatee injury and manatee mortality.
Okay, do you have any other questions for us?
Well, actually, we have a lot of questions, and I know they're still coming in if we have time. Here's one, again, from Miss Elliott's 5th grade class. How high is the water going to get during sea level rise?
Ugh,
that's
a hard one.
I may tackle that a little bit. Of course, we really don't know much about the future. You know, you never know where it's going to go, but we are experiencing a rise in sea level. And one thing that's predicted in the next 50 to 100 years, it could rise as much as almost a meter. And if you're wondering what that means, you can see the water here below the surface of the pier. Gosh, maybe in 100 years, the water may be approaching the top of that. Now, that's some of the predictions from the data that we have now, but I guess we'll find out more about that as we move into the future and learn more.
Now we're going to go over to Angela, and she's going to be talking to you about the salt marsh habitat, and we have some live animals to show you. So take it away, Angela.
Thank you, Margaret. I just want to talk a little bit about a salt marsh. If you look behind me, you can see a beautiful salt marsh that fringes Weeks Bay. And salt marshes are just low coastal grasslands that are frequently flooded. Now, the marsh can be divided into zones depending on their elevation in the marsh and how frequently that area is flooded. The low marsh is lowest in elevation and closest to the water, so it's flooded regularly by the daily tides. And the plants that you find here have to be adapted to having their feet wet continually. The high marsh is behind the low marsh. It's slightly higher in elevation, but it is irregularly flooded. And usually only flooded when we have storm surges or really, really high tides. And then the land beyond the high marsh just transitions into forested area. Now, the marsh is extremely important for the health of our estuaries and our bays. The grasses are able to hold that marsh soil together, thus preventing erosion, especially when we have storm surges. The grasses also are able to filter sediment and break down pollution, keeping them out of our bays and estuaries. Juvenile shrimp and fish and crabs are able to swim up into those flooded marshes and find food and protection, but larger animals use these marshes as a place to find food and shelter. And with us today, we have Rick O'Connor. Rick is a biology teacher at Washington High School in Escambia County, Florida, and he and his students do research on diamondback terrapins. And Rick, you have a terrapin with you today, don't you?
Yes, we do. This is Spot. This is a male diamondback terrapin. The terrapins are salt marsh animals. They prefer brackish water. They're exclusively brackish. They don't venture into fresh water or the ocean very often. Our friends along the East Coast probably see quite a few of these in the Chesapeake Bay area, but along the Gulf Coast, they're rare. It's hard to find them. There's pockets of populations all along the Gulf Coast here. They like the grass, the creeks that move through the grass are the areas that they prefer. They spend all their lives in those creeks and don't venture very far from them. It's breeding season right now. They're actually up on the beaches nesting, and what they need for nesting are sandy areas along the springs and the creeks along these. And they'll lay 6 to 10 eggs a couple of times during the year. Now this is a male. The one we have here is known as the Mississippi Diamondback. He won't get much larger than this. The female is maybe about twice the size of this one. These animals are having a tough time along the Gulf Coast. Primarily habitat loss, dredge and fill of the marshes has been a real problem for them. Another issue that we're having is the crab traps. A lot of the crab traps, these animals tend to swim into them, and being reptiles, unfortunately they can't breathe, and so they tend to drown in them. There are some traps that have modified devices that you can put on side of to keep the terrapins from moving in. And along the East Coast, they're using those quite a bit, and we're trying to get more of those used here along the Gulf Coast.
Well, would you like to show one of those traps?
Yeah,
I think we have some
sure.
up front.
All right, these are what we will call a derelict or ghost trap. These are traps that are left in the bay and aren't actually fished. And these are real problems here because no one's actually watched. There's all kinds of animals that get caught in these things and drown. So we're trying to have all of these removed, and in Florida there are trap removal days. This is a crab trap that has the device that we're talking about called a BIRDS, bycatch reduction device. You can see the size of it, basically a mirror size from a car, and you can do it horizontally or vertically. There's experiments going on right now trying to decide which design works best. The big problem is the females are the ones that go in. The males tend to follow. So if you can keep the females out, then the males tend to stay out as well. And a study up in the Chesapeake area showed that not only did this help keep terrapins out of the trap, it actually improved the number and size of crabs they were catching there. So it's a good idea.
Thank you, Rick. Now joining us is Susan Clement. She is a biologist at the Environmental Studies Center, which is part of Mobile County Public School System. And Susan has a brown pelican with her. And brown pelican is a unique story. It's one of our success stories. The brown pelican was once listed as endangered, but now has been delisted. And would you like to tell us a little bit about the success of our brown pelicans?
Well, basically what happened with the brown pelicans was back in the 70s, they noticed the population was getting lower, and studies were done, and they found out that there was a chemical that farmers were using as a pesticide called DDT. And this DDT was actually, it was getting into the water, fish were ingesting it, and of course pelicans eat fish. And the DDT was affecting the shells of the pelicans' eggs. And so the shells were actually breaking before the babies could hatch, and of course that's going to cause a population depletion.
Right.
So as soon as it was discovered what was causing the problem, they banned its use, and after that, then their population grew quite a bit.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And can you just tell us a little bit about pelicans, what they do out here in the marsh?
Well, let me introduce, this is Goody.
Okay.
Goody is our brown pelican, and the reason that we have her is because she came to us wrapped up in fishing line. Fishing line is a horrible thing. If it gets, if it's found just loose and in piles in the water. And she had wrapped up her wing in fishing line, and she had broke her wing trying to get out of the fishing line. So when she came to us, she was wrapped up, broken wing, and it was so badly damaged that she could not be returned to the wild. So that's why we have her. Brown pelicans, really cool birds. First thing everybody notices is the beak. We have a very long, funny-looking beak here. It's used to catch fish. That's what they eat. They actually dive into the water head first, scoop the fish up with the beak. They have the skin underneath their beak called the pouch that can expand. It can hold over a gallon of water. They don't have teeth, so they actually swallow their fish whole. And they also have webbed feet for swimming, kind of like a duck. This is another adaptation that they have. They don't have an external nose like we do. They just have, their nose is literally in their mouth. They have their trachea inside of their pouch that allows them to breathe. And of course, when they have water or food in their mouth, they can close off that trachea. So they're cool birds, real cool.
Well, do you have any suggestions for our audience for what they should do if they find injured wildlife?
Well, first of all, you know, you always have to be careful. Wildlife can be very dangerous. Pelicans, the dangerous part of them is that beak. You know, they've got a very sharp point in the end, and they can reach out and, you know, pierce you pretty badly. So you always want to get that head covered, and that's how it is with most wildlife. Cover the body with a sheet or a towel, and that calms them down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to go to LG now for a few questions from our students. If you'd like to come up. LG, what do we have?
Actually, we have questions just rolling in. Thanks for all the response that y'all are giving us. This is a question from Miss Latsko's third grade class at Williams Elementary, and she asked, what happens to pollution when the tide ebbs?
Would you like to answer that
I
one?
could. Our tide comes and go here with the you know, the days as they pass. We're unusual here. We have one high and one low tide, and pollution that would be, you know, pollution is really anything that is out there in the water that shouldn't be, whether it's trash or other solids or something soluble. So if it's dissolved in water, it stays in the water column. As the tide goes out, it'll leave Weeks Bay. If the tide comes in, we actually can receive pollution from the greater Mobile Bay coming into Weeks Bay. One thing that we see a lot of moving around is sediment. We have a sediment problem in our watershed with various development activity, and that sediment comes down and settles in Weeks Bay. Sometimes we have sediment moving in from Mobile Bay that settles out in the quiet waters of Weeks Bay. So pretty much the pollution comes and go with the water. Sometimes when it's slack, the tide's not moving, solids will fall out and precipitate out, those types of things. Another question, Ms. Latsko's class again, are there any invasive species that are dangerous to the native species?
Rick, would you like to answer that, or Susan?
Well, I know the area where I'm studying terrapins, torpedo grass has become quite a problem there. It's outplacing what we call cord grass and the juncus over there. As far as its impact on terrapins or some of the other animals, it's a little early to tell. What I see is some of the snakes seem to be hanging out in the torpedo grass, but a lot of the other animals seem to be avoiding it. So in addition to losing some of the grasses, some of the other animals are avoiding those invasives.
Right. And I think here at Weeks Bay we have a lot of invasive species that are aquatic, and they start out competing some of our native aquatic plant species, and that's bad because then the animals don't have their native foods to eat.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you have another one, LG?
Yep, well, we got lots of questions. Here's a question from Mrs. Stewart's biology class at East High School. How do salt marsh plants live in salt water?
Well, the cordgrass actually has glands on them that secrete the salt outside. You can actually see the salt crystals on the cordgrass, and it actually grows closer to the water line. That greenish, brighter green grass is the one. The darker grass, the needle rush, doesn't tolerate the salt as much as the cordgrass, so it tends to live further off the edge and doesn't have those glands that I was talking about.
Okay, thank you.
We have a couple of great questions here for our group now. Same class, Miss Stewart's biology class. What is the difference between a turtle and a terrapin?
All right, great question. Really, nothing. The terminology came from all the different explorers who came here. Some were from England, some were from Spain, and the terms got all jingled up between a tortoise, a turtle, and a terrapin. In the turtle world, we basically call them all turtles. But here in the United States, the word terrapin is recognized with the brackish water species that we have.
I think we may have a couple of questions about this segment from a...
Okay, but here's one right here.
Oh, great.
What do pelicans do during hurricanes?
Basically, they just kind of hunker down. You know, they try to find that they don't fly away from the hurricane. You know, there's no way they can go all the way inland, but they'll just find an area that's, you know, around trees, near grasses, just to kind of sit down, stay still. They don't fly around and just, you know, ride it out, basically.
Very interesting. I'd hate to be the pelican having to ride out the storm.
Here's a question from 9th grade, Robertsdale High School, Mr. Williford's class. How long can the brown pelican stay underwater?
Wow.
Well, you know, they just dive and scoop. They don't dive and stay underwater. So they don't really they don't have to hold their breath for a very long time. But, you know, they can hold their breath for a couple of minutes.
LG, we have another one.
Yep, here's a good one. Are slaughter turtles one of the endangered animals in the estuary?
No. The red-eared slider and the yellow-eared slider are the two that we have real common along the panhandle, and all the indications seem to be that they're doing fine right now. But those turtles don't generally come into the estuaries. They're more freshwater species. There are evidence that some of them will work their way down in the upper part of the bays, but they don't actually live there.
Is it true that the terrapin is the only one that comes into the marsh?
Stays in the marsh, lives there year-round.
Here's a question. How many different kinds of snails and turtles are in your estuary? Now we're about running out of time, but if you could maybe comment on that, either of you?
Well, I know though there's only one that's endemic to the estuary, and that is the diamondback terrapin as far as turtles are concerned. There's some folks who come in and out. As far as snails, there are a variety. The one that's their favorite food is one called the marsh periwinkle. It's very common out there. The terrapins love them.
Well, thank you, Rick. And now we're going to take it to Margaret, who's going to talk to us about Delta freshwater wetlands.
You know, earlier in the show, LG said that an estuary is anywhere where rivers meet the sea. So this segment is going to be about animals that live in the river delta. A little bit about deltas. LG also mentioned that we have a tremendous amount of rivers that come into the top of Mobile Bay, and when rivers come into a large shallow body of water, for instance a bay, then the water slows down and it spreads out. And when the water slows down, it tends to drop a lot of the sediment that it's carrying with it. And deltas actually get their name because that sediment usually forms triangle shapes, and that's the shape of a delta, the Greek letter delta. And so deltas are very important habitats for different species of animals. And here with me I have, this is Dr. David Nelson, and he's with the University of South Alabama. He's a biologist there, and he also happens to be a pretty good expert on the Alabama red-bellied turtle.
The Alabama red-bellied turtle inhabits the Mobile-Tensaw Delta in the freshwaters. They occur in the rivers, in the bays, and the backwaters. The major reason for their endangered status is because of an extremely restricted geographic distribution. They're found only in the southern parts of Mobile and Baldwin County in and around the Delta, and in one river system in Mississippi. This is the official state reptile for Alabama.
Can you tell us a little bit about what these things eat and where they nest and that kind of stuff?
Very good. They're vegetarians. They stay in the water most of their lives. They feed upon the submergent plants, and like all turtles, they lay eggs on land. And this is a shell of an adult female. One like this may weigh 13 pounds, and they come onto land to lay their eggs in June and July.
So that female, it looks like, does that shell actually have a red belly on it?
The belly of the female tends to turn more yellowish with age. When they're young, they're quite red, and they get more yellow with age. So this one is more yellow.
Okay, I see you have some live ones over here in your terrarium. Why don't you pick one of those up and show us, or
Okay.
You want to show us the eggs
first? Yeah, I'm going to
first?
show you the eggs first because these are what the eggs look like. These turtles lay from 16 to 18 eggs at a time, and oftentimes they're eaten by raccoons and other animals. These are what the eggshells look like if the raccoon has had dinner. And if
So, first I have a question about the shells. So these are not like shells like an eggshell. These are more like what? Kind of describe them.
These are the remnants of the egg, with the egg having been eaten. So oftentimes you're walking around and you see the remainders of the egg.
So are they kind of leathery, I guess is what I'm getting at? They don't have hard shells like chickens. They have leathery
semi-hard,
shells.
but they're somewhat hard.
Okay.
This is a hatchling Alabama red-bellied turtle. You see the reddish color underneath. This is a juvenile, 1 year old, that hatched March a year ago. Again, it has the bright red color, and you can see they're fairly bright. The problems of the Alabama red-bellied turtle are numerous. When we dredge rivers, we cause siltation, we damage the vegetation. Like all reptiles, they're cold-blooded and they need to bask for body heat. If we remove the basking logs, they have difficulty remaining active. When we build bulkheads or lay rocks on the side, they can't get to the land to lay their eggs. And oftentimes when we remove the vegetation, their eggs are more obvious to the predators, the raccoons and the possums and things.
So if you had one thing that you could ask people, the students and the teachers out there, that they could do to help out the Alabama red-bellied turtle, what would it be?
What we can do to conserve the Alabama red-bellied turtle is to conserve its habitat with the fresh water, keep the vegetation that they can eat, allow them basking logs on which to bask, allow them places to nest near the water, free access, and watch them on the road because we hit them with our cars on the causeway.
Okay, well, thanks. And now we have another visitor, and I'm going to have to walk around here for this one. This happens to be, this is Wesley Moore, and he is the owner and operator of Alligator Alley in Summerdale, Alabama. And Wes is going to tell us about the American alligator that he has here.
Yes, this is one of our alligators we have at Alligator Alley. This is a 4.5-year-old animal. Alligators are found common coastally all the way from South Carolina all through Texas. Imagine, Margaret, if you and I got in a canoe and paddled around, we could probably find quite a few alligators here very close by. This little alligator is about 4.5 years old. When alligators are born, they're only about 7.5 to 8 inches long. So alligators have a lot of predators. They get eaten by a lot of other things. Unfortunately, when they get about 10 feet, they just start eating everything back. One thing I would like to say about alligators is although they are quite docile, they are a very dangerous predator. One thing I like to emphasize to people is, first of all, don't ever feed an alligator. Alligators, his brain is about as big as the tip of your thumb. His stomach is as big as a 55-gallon trash can. So you can imagine what he thinks about all the time. And once alligators start to get fed by people, they start to tend to build associations with people. And being that they have that people association, they tend to lose that natural fear of us. So don't feed an alligator. Always be vigilant with small children and pets, because unfortunately our pets, four-legged furry animals, fit right into that size category of otters and beavers. And unfortunately for the red-bellied turtle, turtles are by far one of the vast favorites of an alligator's diet.
I know that you have an alligator farm, and so you feed your alligators different than what they would eat out in the wild. Tell us what an alligator about this size would eat if it was out here in the river delta.
Outside, this alligator's going to eat a lot of different things. He's going to eat a lot of crustaceans, crawfish, crabs, snakes, frogs, small fish. Juvenile alligators eat a lot of insects. The chitin that actually makes up the insect's exoskeleton is a very important part of this alligator's skeletal development. So basically, he's going to eat whatever he can fit in his grubby little jaws.
And tell us about this particular one that you're holding. I am very grateful that it has its mouth taped up so that it can't, because I'm on the business end of it.
Exactly. Oh, there we go.
And it's starting to slap you in the back with its tail. So
That's
tell
all
us a little bit about that. How long is it and where'd you get it?
He's just a little camera shy. This little alligator is about 4.5 years old. This is one that I hatched myself at Alligator Alley. Again, when alligators are born, they're only about 7.5 to 8 inches long, so they're about the size of the palm of your hand. They'll get about a foot per year under prime conditions. Now, being that I keep my alligators really well fed, that would be considered a prime condition. So this little guy is right on schedule. The bigger they get, they start to evolve to eating bigger things. In the next couple of years, if this alligator, if he was out in the wild roaming around the marsh, he's going to switch from eating small crustaceans and snakes and frogs to things like beavers, otters, turtles, and other wading birds. This is about the size when they bite, when it really starts to hurt.
Yeah, I don't want to find that out.
You and me both.
One more thing about alligators that I'd like to know. What happens to alligators in the wintertime? I don't tend to see them out in the rivers and things during the wintertime. Where do they go? What do they do?
Well, being a reptile, alligators are not really fond of cold weather. They can have dens and burrows up under the banks. They can use natural disasters to their advantage, like hurricanes, where a lot of these hurricanes blow over these really large cypress trees and pine trees. Alligators can actually get up underneath the root ball of that tree and find a nice deep hole. They can hold their breath for a very long time. When it gets down into the 30s and 40s, if an alligator wants to stay under all day long, he has absolutely no problem in doing so.
I see LG over here with some questions, and we're going to ask Dr. Nelson to step back over here, and we're going to find out some questions. And here you go, LG. What questions do you have?
We have a question from Mrs. Benner, 6th grade at Somerset Intermediate. Do alligators and crocs live in the brackish water together like in the Everglades?
Well, I think that's a Wesley question.
Yes, they do. The Everglades National Park is the only place in the world that the alligator and the American crocodile do cohabit. Now, the American crocodile, he is a highly endangered species, and so their numbers are quite limited. But the Everglades, they do live together quite peacefully. Thank goodness we have no American crocs here in Weeks Bay.
Have another question?
Yep. This question is from Sparkman 9th grade school. How many red-bellied turtles are there? Are they about to become extinct?
We don't know how many there are. I've marked over 400. They have a wide distribution, at least locally in the Delta. They have a lot of area they can live, and most of it's owned by the state. And habitat destruction is their major problem.
Do we have another question?
We do. From Stapleton Elementary 4th grade, Mrs. Mattis and Mrs. Sterrell's classes. How long could the red-bellied turtle live?
We don't know how long they live, probably 40 or 50 or 60 years. Some turtles can live longer. Turtles as a group are a long-lived group.
Just one note, the Alabama red-bellied turtle is actually the Alabama state reptile. So that's why they're very interesting, and people from here in Baldwin County, schools from here in Baldwin County are asking about them.
We had a question earlier about alligators and crocodiles, and we have another one. This is from the Pepperell Middle School, Miss Kopp's 8th grade science class. What's the difference between an alligator and a crocodile?
That is the most commonly asked question. The alligator's top jaw is actually much wider than his bottom jaw, and so when the alligator's mouth is closed, you'll see his bottom teeth are not visible because they actually fit in slots inside of his top teeth. The crocodile, on the other hand, has a much more tapered top and bottom jaw, and they are both of equal width. So when the mouth is closed, the bottom teeth, particularly the fourth tooth on the lower jaw, is exposed. That is the greatest difference I can give you, other than maybe some temperament issues.
Yep. Here's a question that we may have touched on before, but very quickly, do we have crocodiles in the United States?
Yes, sir, we do. The American crocodile is the largest reptile in North America. Right now, we would find him strictly in the Everglades National Park as far as our territorial range, but that same crocodile does make it all the way down to Costa Rica and Belize.
Okay, and can alligators eat turtles?
Oh.
Unfortunately for the red-bellied turtle, about 80% of an alligator's diet are turtles. A big 10-foot alligator is going to have an average bite force of around 1,800 to 2,000 pounds, and so crushing that turtle shell up is absolutely no problem whatsoever.
Another question still coming from Pepperell Middle School. How can you tell an Alabama red-bellied turtle from other turtles?
They have a yellow arrow on the top of the head, they have an eye bar, and they have a notch with two projections in front of the jaw, cusps, unique to that turtle.
Because what you're saying is they don't always have a red belly. So if you find a turtle out in the river...
Not always, but usually.
Say
not
that
always.
again.
They usually have red bellies, but not always.
Great, thanks. Another question?
And how big do Alabama red-bellied turtles get?
13 pounds and about 14 inches, larger than that shell there. Good size.
And here's a question maybe for you, Margaret. It's still from Pepperell Middle School. How many rivers flow into Weeks Bay?
Oh, that's an easy one. We have the Fish River, which we're standing right here at the mouth of right now. And then we have another river, the Magnolia River, which flows in from the east. So we have two rivers that come into Weeks Bay.
This might be another good one for you, Margaret. The biology class, 9th grade, Lawrence Central School in upstate New York. Do you have major tidal change?
We don't have major tidal change compared to other areas of the United States. And it's really funny because we have what are called diurnal tides down here, which means we only have one high tide and one low tide a day. And the tidal range is only about 1 foot or less. Have time for one more question?
Okay, this might be a tough one. Miss Steele's 5th grade class from Spalding Elementary in Durham, North Carolina. What factors cause plants to invade other ecosystems?
Oh, I'll have to try that one very briefly. A lot of times people bring in plants that they like, they happen to be pretty or something, and they get released one way or another out into the wild. And if that plant happens to be a good habitat for that plant to live, then they just sort of out-reproduce and can survive lots of extremes, and that's why certain plants become invasive. So never drop plants outside, always dispose of them. And I'm going to turn this back over to Angela now, and I think she's going to be talking about the longleaf pine savanna.
Thank you, Margaret. Just a little information about longleaf pines in the ecosystem. Longleaf pines are one of 11 pine species that we have here in Alabama. They're characterized by having the largest cone and the longest needles. The ecosystem is extremely diverse, with there being hundreds of plant and animal species. And some of these species are what we call endemic, meaning they're found nowhere else on Earth. A unique feature about this habitat is that they are fire maintained, meaning they need frequent, low-intensity fires to go through the forest to help maintain the structure and diversity of the forest. And in fact, many land managers use what we call prescribed fire, which is just an intentional controlled fire to maintain those forests. Now, all the plants and animals are adapted to having fire. The longleaf pine does it by growing in stages. It begins its life as what we call a grass stage, where fire is able to sweep very quickly over those long needles. It then jumps up into what we call a candelabra stage, where the sensitive growing portions of the tree are held well above the fire, and eventually reaches a mature stage where it has extremely thick bark that helps insulate it from the subsequent fires. Now, the longleaf pine ecosystem used to be the most dominant ecosystem in the southeast, ranging from Virginia all the way to East Texas and covering about 90 million acres. But because of man-made pressures, this range has been reduced to about 3% of that original range. And with the loss of ecosystem comes a loss of diversity. And so to tell us about one of the animals that lives in the longleaf pine forest is Dan, and we've seen Dan earlier. Dan has a gopher tortoise with him, and Dan, I hear that gopher tortoises are extremely an important species within an ecosystem. Can you tell me just a little bit about it and why it's so important?
Yes, this is a gopher tortoise. This is a beautiful animal. It's one of our favorite animals down here in the southeastern United States. And its range roughly is found wherever longleaf pine used to be. It's found in states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, a small bit of South Carolina, a small bit of Louisiana, and it's also very common in Florida. And it's found in piney woods, and that habitat that she described, the longleaf pine habitat that was frequently burned. Because of that frequent burning, what it did is it had widely spaced pine trees, and it had low vegetation, and it allowed this colonial animal to be able to wander around in the piney woods, travel around from burrow to burrow to burrow, visiting other tortoises, find mates, find nesting habitat, and it turns out that those grasses that grew in that fire-dependent habitat is what this animal still loves to eat. So everything that the longleaf pine forest had was perfect habitat for this particular gopher tortoise. This gopher tortoise is 25 to 30 years old. This is a female gopher tortoise. A couple of things that you can see it's adapted for is, notice these wonderful feet. They're designed to be like shovels. It burrows into the sandy soils that are found down here in the coastal plain part of Alabama. So these feet are able to dig quickly into those sandy soils, and the back feet are designed to scoot that soil right out the burrow that it's digging. These burrows are quite a structure. They can be as much as 9 feet deep, sometimes as much as 20 feet long. And one of the reasons the gopher tortoise is so important in these habitats is it's called a keystone species. There are a lot of other species that depend on those burrows to survive. The gopher tortoise needs the burrows because it does get very hot here in Alabama. If you spent some time down here in our climate, coming here in June, July, and August, you'll remember it. The gopher tortoise, what it's able to do is get down into the burrows and avoid some of those hot temperatures during the daytime. And it also does freeze occasionally here in the wintertime, and it also is able to avoid freezing temperatures during the winter season. Because it's able to do that, there are a lot of other organisms that are able to take advantage of that burrow. Things like indigo snakes, black pine snakes, a lot of different rodents and small mammals. A lot of the insect life that are in the longleaf pine forest also survive because of these gopher tortoise. So they create structure and a habitat that many, many other animals are able to utilize. And because they eat grasses and a lot of plants, one of the things they also do is in their droppings, they are also scattering and distributing seeds across the landscape. So this is a very important part of the longleaf pine ecosystem. And one thing, go ahead.
Well, can you tell me why they're becoming so rare?
Well, as we mentioned, that longleaf pine habitat has largely disappeared throughout the Southeast. And the small patches of forest we have left now are very difficult to burn. Often they're surrounded by houses and buildings, and there are roads, and there's other things that we have to worry about. So it's difficult to be able to burn those habitats like we used to, so they grow a lot of vegetation very quickly. And so the gopher tortoise ends up having to find a habitat along the edge of many of these forests. Sometimes there's a road there, or there's a housing development, and so they're running out of places really to live the kind of life that they need to have that big open piney woods habitat.
Okay, well thank you, Dan. And now we're going to talk to Roger Clay. Roger is a biologist with the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries Division, and you have one of those snakes that we just talked about. Which one is this?
Right, Dan mentioned the black pine snake, and this is a black pine snake. Pine snakes are found in the all the southeastern states. In Alabama, we have 3 subspecies or varieties of pine snake: black pine snake and Florida pine snake here in South Alabama, and then in central and northern Alabama, you may have the northern pine snake. You find these snakes in, hence the name, in the piney woods, in the drier uplands, and certainly in the longleaf pine habitats. This particular pine snake, black pine snake, was captured here in Baldwin County, and it's in an area where the range of the Florida and the black pine cross, and so you see some of the evidence of Florida pine snake in this particular pine snake. Now these snakes spend quite a bit of time underground in old rotten stump holes and rotted out root runs, and in loose soil they could burrow themselves. They're powerful constrictors. They grab the animals they want to eat, and what they eat could be small mammals, small rabbits, rats and mice, birds, maybe lizards, but they grab it and coil it up and kill the animal that way and eat it. Now, black pine snakes are scarce in Alabama, and they're protected by state laws. But another snake that is protected by federal laws is on the endangered species list we've heard about before. It's the next snake, and that would be the eastern indigo snake. Now it's a snake that is really tied to the longleaf pine forest. It still occurs in Georgia and Florida. In Georgia, the lower third part of the state. It used to occur in Alabama, but we're not sure we have them in Alabama anymore. In fact, one hasn't been documented in some 20 years. Now, I mentioned they're found in longleaf pine ecosystems, and they're really also dependent upon the gopher tortoise as well. In the cold months, they use the gopher tortoise burrow to seek shelter. In the warm months, they retreat down to the wetlands and stream sides where it's a lot cooler. And they eat similar things that the black pine snake eats, but in addition to the mammals and birds, they also eat other snakes, and they can even eat venomous snakes, like eastern diamondback rattlesnakes are a favored food for this snake. And the snake is essentially immune from the effects of the venom of the rattlesnake. Now, what's caused the decline of these snakes? So several factors. Of course, the decline or alteration of the habitats along longleaf pine forest has been a factor. Of course, unfortunately, snakes in the past and even today are killed outright. And so these large snakes, if they're encountered out in the wild, easy targets, and unfortunately are killed. And another factor with the eastern indigo snake, in the past they were favored for the pet trade because this snake grows to be the longest snake in North America. Pine snake might reach 6 feet, but the indigo snake can reach over 8 feet in length.
Wow.
So it's a very impressive snake, and people like to capture them in the past.
Well, can you tell us what we can do to help species like the indigo snake and the pine snake and even the gopher tortoise?
Sure. Certainly if you're fortunate enough to own any longleaf pine habitat or piney woods, you want to manage them properly, and that's going to include periodic fires, prescribed burnings. As far as with the snakes go, everybody can do this. If you encounter a snake in the wild, certainly don't kill it. There's no reason to kill the snakes. Snakes are very beneficial to us all. And I guess particularly for young people, just learn about snakes. I believe in the United States we have over 100 species. In the Southeast, I believe it's 53. And snakes are a very fascinating, interesting group of animals. And I think the more you learn about them, the more you're going to appreciate them.
Wonderful. Well, they're both very beautiful, and I think we're going to go to LG for a few questions.
We have questions still rolling in, quite a few. Here's a question from Washington High School, BT Washington High School. And it might be for you, Angela, how big can pine cones get?
Oh my gosh, how big can pine cones get? Well, let's look at this one. I would say that's probably about 8 inches or so, and this is probably about as large as they get. I found this one out in the woods the other day, so I'd say about 8 inches.
Okay. Here's a question from 4th grade Sparta School. How tall can a longleaf pine get?
Longleaf pines can get to be, I don't know, would you say 120 feet or so? They're very tall trees, and they're actually very long-lived trees. That means that they can live to be about 300 to 500 years old.
Here's one from Mrs. Benner, 6th grade Somerset Intermediate School. Can longleaf pines be competition to other plants and leaves?
I wouldn't say that they are competition. They are native. They belong here. And I actually think that a lot of the other plants that we have here are becoming competition for them because we're not allowing the natural burning to occur.
Here's another question. When you start the fires, I guess that's prescribed fires or burns, are any animals harmed in the process?
Why don't we let Dan answer this?
It's possible, but animals that grow up in a fire-adapted forest community have strategies to get out of the way. They will often, if they're able to run, they'll do so. For the gopher tortoise, for example, they have those great burrows, and it also provides a nice fire escape for a lot of other creatures around the area. So birds can fly. There may be possibly a small number of animals that are affected by fire or the smoke or something like that. But in general, those fire-adapted communities have animals that are very used to fire, and they do just fine.
Great. Another one?
Yep, more questions. How many animals use a gopher tortoise burrow?
Oh, would you like to answer that, or?
I don't know if I can give you an exact number, but there are a lot. There's been a lot of research that's been done here in Alabama and Georgia and other locations actually looking at the number of organisms that are discovered in these gopher tortoise burrows, and we find more and more all the time, and it's from the very small insects and spiders, the different types of ants, all the way to possibly even things like some birds use the habitat in some ways. So the more you look, the more we find, and so the number probably is in the hundreds of species that are able to utilize these gopher tortoise burrows.
That's amazing.
Here's a question, maybe this is a good question for Roger. What is the biggest snake at Weeks Bay, and would you die if you got bitten by that snake?
Let's see. Probably some of the bigger snakes around Weeks Bay, certainly gray rat snakes are one of the, it's by far the largest, the most common large snake we have, 5 feet and longer. Mud snakes that occur in wetter areas around here could exceed 6 feet. But both those snakes are harmless. All snakes have a mouth, have teeth, they can bite you, but there's only a few that are potentially harmful. That would be the rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouth. And either one of these snakes bit us today, it might hurt a little bit, but it wouldn't do us any permanent harm.
Good question. LG, do we have another question?
Boy, these questions keep coming. I'm not sure if we have time for all these questions. What types of snakes are in the estuary here?
Yeah, there's a variety of snakes. There's a number of snakes that you do find around wet areas, and certainly around the estuary. It's plenty wet around here. I already mentioned the mud snake. Here recently, the staff here at the reserve, someone turned in a rainbow snake, which is a beautiful multicolored snake. There's several snakes, people generally call them moccasins or water snakes. So you're probably talking about a dozen snakes or so that you can find around wet areas.
Another question, LG?
Real quick about snakes, what is the most endangered snake in Alabama?
Probably this one here. I mentioned before, they once occurred historically in Alabama. There hasn't been one documented in over 20 years. But every now and then we get a report, someone thinks they saw one. So this snake and southern hognose will be another very rare one in Alabama.
And how does a snake move?
2 ways. They can use that classic serpentine motion where they, the classic sideways motion with the snake, but also using their belly scales, they can kind of crawl caterpillar style in a straight line.
Well, thank you guys. I think that's all the time we have for questions now. We'd just like to thank you for participating in our program today. And if we weren't able to answer all of your questions on air, we will be posting answers on our wiki webpage. And we've just had a wonderful time being able to show you all of these animals and talk about the coastal ecosystems of Alabama, haven't we?
We sure have, and today we've only been able to just touch on a few of the habitats and just a few of the animals. But what we want you teachers to do with your classes is go out and research some of the animals and the habitats that are found in your area and think of ways that you can help wildlife in your area.
Well, we're certainly glad that you joined us here today at beautiful Weeks Bay in Alabama on the northern Gulf Coast. This 10 o'clock show, at least at Central Time, is going to be followed by another show at 1 o'clock Central, 2 o'clock Eastern. And that'd be real good if you missed some things or had more questions to ask, then that'd be a real good time to try to tune in. That'd be great if you could do that. And as Margaret said, there'll be an opportunity to see some of the answers to the questions that we didn't have time to answer, and that'd be really good. And also, if you want to learn more about Weeks Bay Reserve here in coastal Alabama, you can go to our website. That's www.weeksbayreserve.com. And Margaret, maybe you real quick could tell again how to keep sending those questions in, or how they can access those questions in a later time that we didn't have a chance to answer.
Sure, we're going to have those the answers posted on the wiki page to the questions that we couldn't answer on the air. But you also can submit your questions on the question form that's on the Estuary Live page. And we have a little bit of a delay of when you submit those questions and when we can actually get them down here to read them. So the sooner you have questions, send them quickly so that we can go ahead and have them down here to answer for you.
Okay, and we want to just let y'all know that we had a good time with y'all. I hope y'all enjoyed today. One thing that you want to keep in mind is that wherever you live, you are in the watershed of an estuary. Whether you're in the intercontinental part of the United States or near a coast, those waters that flow downhill eventually go into a river and wind up on the coast and impact an estuary. So please do everything you can to protect water quality. Maybe you can get participated in volunteer groups to help in the watershed that you're in, and always think about those productive estuaries that you are impacting and be good stewards. We're glad y'all could connect with us today, and we hope to see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.